Thanks for everybody for joining us today. My name is Rachel, and I am the Director of Lifecycle and Customer Growth here at Greenshades. I'm going to keep my intro brief because the person you are actually going to want to hear from is Katherine Diersing, our VP of Client Success, and she's going to be driving most of today's conversation. But before I hand it over, let me give you a quick sense of what we'll be covering here today. Catherine and her team work with payroll and HR organizations every single day through implementation, onboarding, and long after go live. They see a lot of what works and what doesn't, and what we're here to do today is share what they've noticed. Across a lot of payroll teams, a lot of different industries such as staffing, healthcare, construction, transportation, certain patterns show up again and again. Payroll operates inside a web of other people, other systems, and other timelines. And when that web doesn't necessarily have the right structure, things can get hard. So that's what we're here today to cover, what those patterns are and what effective teams are doing differently. All right, Catherine is going to walk you through five of those patterns, talk about what she sees in teams that handle complexity well, and spend some time on a question we hear quite a lot, which is if your payroll is actually structured to scale. We're going to start with a bit of framing on why payroll gets harder to manage as organizations grow and why the structure around it often doesn't keep up. Then we'll spend the bulk of our time on the five patterns themselves. We'll follow that with what we observe in teams that operate well and spend some time on the operating model question. How payroll itself gets structured as a function and what that actually means in practice. And with that, Catherine, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. All right. So, what I'm excited to talk to you about today are some of the things that we have seen our customers do really well that we believe might be some best practices that could also help you in your organization. So, pretty consistently, as we work with payroll teams across a lot of industries, most payroll operations were built for a specific point in time. And as the business has changed and grown and usually become more complex, um, those processes that once worked great may not work so great anymore. And so as the business grows, you're adding employees, you're adding jurisdictions, there's more states, you're taking on more complex clients or maybe employees that have reciprocity, things like that. You're adding pay types, you're adding all kinds of complexity into that your original process may not have been designed for. So here's where it gets really interesting and where some organizations can get stuck. So as the instinct kind of becomes, if it's harder, you might want to look for a better tool, and that sometimes is a part of the equation. New software, new platform, and but what we've really found is that the teams who grow well and handle the complexity and absorb the complexity as their business grows, they do two things in order. One, they take care of the process first, and then they find the technology that best suits them. And if it goes the other way around, sometimes what they find is that even really great software can have a difficult time delivering what it promised if the process isn't great. Okay, so growth makes payroll more complex. Lack of structure opens the opportunity to make payroll a bit chaotic. They're two different problems, and one of them is definitely avoidable. All right, so let's jump into the patterns. And before I do that, I want to make sure that we're kind of starting from the same place. So I'm going to describe something and you can kind of, indicate if this might represent you or your team either now or at some point in your career. So transaction volume. So the bigger you get, the more you're processing, the more employees, the more different pay types, variables in every single pay run. And individually, one of them is manageable, but they start to compound and that can create a real load sometimes. The second structural pressure is a tight, undefined, or loosely defined payroll cycle windows. So weekly pay is a standard across a ton of industries. And so we see that quite a bit. And if you think about that, if your timesheets are due on a Monday and payroll needs to be out by 1 o'clock on Wednesday to make sure that we hit the ACH files, you might have 2 days to catch something if somebody alerts you to an issue, maybe with a timesheet, a missing timesheet, or a timesheet that hasn't that wasn't submitted, and that it can be a very quick turnaround. So sometimes those undefined or loosely defined processes or typed windows can really cause some complexity into your process. Multi-system data flow is another one. This is very common. A lot of organizations don't run everything out of one system. So HR may be in one place, time is in another. And when the data has to travel between those systems and or people, that's where things can kind of fall through the cracks. Those handoffs are really critical, and making sure that there is kind of a really clear transition as far as this is where my ownership ends, this is where the next person begins, person or system is really critical. And then multi-jurisdictional compliance. So every state line an employee crosses adds another set of tax rules. County and city lines add even more. And it typically doesn't level off. It usually compounds. Things are constantly changing. So as you're adding more employees and growth into your business, that's something that continues to compound. And finally, a really thin error tolerance, which is standard for all of us. Payroll is serious business. We have an obligation and a requirement to get those checks out to people on time and correctly. And so this one is a bit different from the others because it's not very abstract. It's somebody's paycheck. It's real. The stakes are very high in every single run. And saying to somebody, we'll catch it on the next cycle really doesn't feel okay to them or to our payroll practitioners who are responsible for getting those checks out. So while none of this is necessarily avoidable, it is manageable. A growing business doesn't have to mean chaos with payroll, even in the short term. The teams that handle this the best aren't necessarily the teams with the most staff or even the best software. They're the ones who built structure that can absorb the complexity as the business grows. All right, so when payroll breaks down, the instinct is to sometimes look at the calculations. Did something process wrong? Is there a system error? And occasionally that is true, but across hundreds of implementations and thousands of pay cycles, it's really the exception. The real culprit is often the structure behind it. Those handoffs we discussed, somebody not handing up, making a clean handoff or data missing in a handoff. So gaps in the discipline and ownership in process design, that's what we're kind of going to dig into. Not necessarily the calculations, but really the structure around them and how important that is to a smooth payroll. All right, so let's dive into these, the 5 patterns. And I'll tell you up front, none of them are unusual. In most cases, they start as a completely reasonable response to a very real situation. A one-time exception, a system added without updating somebody that owns it, an SOP, not being complete, a change that may have moved faster than the communication around it. They build slowly, but they can accumulate. And suddenly you may find yourself in a position where you've got a couple of complexities that are making things within your payroll operation more challenging. So as I walk through these, keep a mental tally of how many might feel familiar to you. Most people land on about 2 to 4, depending on the size and the situation they are with in their organization. All right, this one, I'm going to set a scene for before I actually name it and go into it. It's a Monday afternoon. You have a check date of Wednesday. Payroll needs to be submitted by 5 p.m. and the timesheets are due at 1. It's 3:45. You're really clicking through that payroll. You're in the middle of your review process and you get a message from a manager submitting a timesheet that was missed. You back out of the payroll, you get everything updated for that individual, you make the adjustment, you go back into your review, and at 4:15, you get another one. The first pattern is undefined time submission discipline. And there's a real cost to this. So customers that have either undefined or loosely defined late pay processing spend between 10 and 25% more time writing payroll every single cycle. That is not a soft estimate. That's hours every single week. And we've seen it with our customers, and we've been able to help them get back to the point where they're not spending that additional 10 to 25% of their time when those processes might be a little bit more loosely defined. So why is it so expensive? When the late time gets folded into a regular run instead of handled separately, it doesn't just add work, it stops the process. So oftentimes we'll talk about you can get that flywheel going, and then someone sticks a rod in the flywheel and you have to stop. And the cost of that to anybody during any process is about 10 minutes typically. So it takes you about 10 minutes to kind of get back into the groove of what you were doing. And assuming that that process works relatively quickly. So once you stop that flywheel, getting it to speed back up costs more than the interaction itself. And it's like anything that runs on momentum, far more efficient to keep it rolling than to stop, add, and start again. What our most successful customers do is they split it. So process everything that came in by the deadline, run that through cleanly, and handle those late submissions as a separate defined late pay process. Not necessarily folded into the main run. And what can sometimes surprise people is that the cutoff doesn't need to change, right? So your process doesn't mean someone's going to be paid late. It doesn't mean that somebody's not going to get that check on time. Really, what it means is you're going to enable some time to get to those adjustments and still meet the same deadline. So even at 70 to 80% adherence, a defined timeline and a defined rate paid process is still going to drive very meaningful, more efficient quality than having no process or a loosely followed process. The goal is not perfect compliance, it's consistency. One more thing, the customers who do this don't just enforce the cutoff internally, they push that timeline and the late pay processes down to their clients, the people in the field. So the deadline isn't something payroll is fighting for alone. It's something everybody upstream already knows. It knows what to expect, understands the process. And when something's late, they know exactly what to do to get that person paid as timely as possible. So when those deadlines become more flexible, payroll becomes more reactive. The second pattern is overlapping payroll cycles. This is really, really common. So this is one trend that can kind of sneak up on organizations. And it starts typically as like a legitimate one-time exception. It might bleed into the next payroll. And before long, you might be managing two open cycles. And I've seen as many as 10 at one time. And what that can create is some real noise in the data. And not just for the payroll team, but maybe for your finance team. Anybody who's looking at labor costing, it shows what is actually happening. And then we may have to go and finish, from fixing something the last week. So that kind of ties back into our first pattern, which was that loosely defined payroll as well. And what the consequences beyond just stopping the payroll practitioner from completing the cycle and getting everybody paid on time. There are other things that naturally occur when that payroll schedule is a little bit loose. When payroll cycles overlap, you can lose clear visibility into labor costs and profitability. And I've also seen where it can cause confusion for the payroll practitioner. They might have one employee in two different pay runs. And that a lot of times leads to an adjustment down the road as well. So kind of keeping things streamlined and organized is not just going to increase the quality of the process, but it will also make things a whole lot easier for the payroll team as well. And downstream for finance teams who need that data and rely on that data for reporting as well. All right, the third pattern is adjustment normalization. You'll see a lot of these things tied very closely together, and it's very closely related to overlapping cycles and late pay. But it is worth separating out because the mechanism is slightly different. So adjustment normalization is what happens when retroactive corrections stop being exceptions and they become more routine. So prior period adjustments, retroactive pay changes, corrections to previous entries. These things get processed, but they're not necessarily always flagged as adjustments. They get absorbed into the run. Over time, the payroll data that really reflects a mix of what actually happened and what was corrected. And it can be very difficult to tell those things apart. So again, we've talked about two things that would help with this, but the one that helps with this the most is really making sure those payroll timelines are consistent and that we have a late pay process so that we can make sure that things are flowing through the process in the system in a timely way and in an organized way. So there's not confusion of who you made an adjustment for and when and in what run. So we've seen organizations where a meaningful percentage of what looked like labor cost variance was actually prior period adjustment activity, and the data being reported in a way that made it pretty impossible for somebody else to interpret correctly. What we see in organizations that handle this really well is some pretty simple discipline. Adjustments get tagged and tracked separately. They still happen. It's going to happen. That is, something that we are always going to have in the world of payroll. And the visibility becomes a good category. So the leadership can kind of see a trend. It means root cause analysis when possible. It might be able to, we've seen this benefit some of our customers in a way that they can target a specific operation within their field that may not be doing their review before submitting timesheets. And so it helps the organization become more efficient, not just from a payroll perspective, but in those field operation situations as well, or directly to the manager where we can say, we're noticing that there are more adjustments coming out of your part of the organization. We'd like to spend some time going through or reviewing training to make that process more consistent. So over time, you really get to be able to demonstrate what the operations are improving. And that's a different story than just running corrections in the background forever. It gives you the data that you need to help your business make the adjustments where it is appropriate and continue that flywheel, as we talked about earlier in the program. All right, pattern 4 is split system ownership gaps. And this one we see fairly consistently as well, also depending on how your payroll teams are set up and or the managers who might be submitting timesheets. That working remotely has also added some complexity to this as well. So if that's something that your team deals with, that can also cause some challenges because you're in different locations. It's not just as easy as asking your neighbor, "Hey, have you completed your play run yet?" So again, this can happen also if you've got some of your data living in different systems, and assignment details may be coming from the front office. Pay rates might be coming from somewhere else. Hours are approved in a totally different part of the organization. And all of that has to land directly in the payroll system before the run. So the question is, who's responsible for making sure the data is accurate at each and every point in the journey? In a lot of organizations, the answer may be that it's not explicitly clear who owned what part of the process. In addition to that, what's the quality check responsibility of that person? And so all of that information may come in, and that front office assumes, and people may assume that kind of the front office is good because the payroll team is going to catch any errors, and the payroll team is hoping that the front office is going to catch some of those things. So when the goal is when the payroll data gets to the payroll team, it's very clean, and it is an exception that they would say something doesn't look correct or is mismatched. Late stage errors can be very, very expensive. When you catch something before the run, you can obviously fix it. If you catch it after, you're looking at an off-cycle correction. We talked about this a few slides ago. And there could be potential compliance exposure as well if it had to touch taxes. And so obviously we want to avoid that where possible. And again, this often leads to when we, do assessments with our customers and say, okay, where did the breakdown occur? A lot of times it comes back that there is some type of a structural thing that we can easily fix and help them with kind of documenting and making sure it's clearly outlined. And again, as those organizations that layer systems over time that you are adding complexity because the business is growing, this is where it becomes really important to have those things well documented and well understood, because you can very easily end up in this situation. Everybody is doing everything right for their part of the business, but it's bringing it all together and making sure that there's a comprehensive solution that again enables that flywheel within the payroll process to work very smoothly. So while it's not necessarily a complicated fix, it's really important to have this. And who owns the process, who owns what along the process. And so what does validation look like? When does that happen? When there is a challenge, what's the process to get an answer to say, yep, that is something that needs to be corrected, and here's the process that we can use to correct it. So it not only helps the payroll team, but it also helps the teams across the business to set their teams up for success in payroll as well. All right, so here's another scenario that we're going to kind of walk through really quickly. And you've got a new system going live, a policy changes, a new compliance requirement kicks in. Maybe you have a client in a staffing environment who introduces a new approval process. That change is real. It can be very legitimate. And the communication about it, who needs to know what, when do they need to know it, who needs to do something differently, either does or if that doesn't happen, it often can be too late. So what follows is generally fairly predictable. Questions start coming in. Managers are confused. Employees are confused. Those questions land on the payroll team, often in the middle of that processing cycle. So again, it can be another rod in that flywheel. when the last thing a payroll processor really is looking for while they're processing payroll is to have to stop and say and answer a question, that somebody might be able to have avoided in the first place. So every inbound question during the processing window is going to slow down that process and puts some quality, introduces some risk into quality. All right. So downstream, that risk can be compliance. We talked about that also a little bit earlier. If you're absorbing new processes at the same time that you're running payroll or making those adjustments, the probability of something, going wrong increases significantly. And the cost of that compliance miss can be anywhere from penalties and incorrect payroll for the week being sent to a employee and or your clients if you are working directly with clients that's your staffing agents. What we observe in teams that handle change really well is a simple discipline. Communication gets out before the change hits a live run, not necessarily not the same day that it's happening, not buried within the system, or an updated email at 4 p.m., but early enough that the time payroll runs, the new rules, everybody who needed to make an adjustment has ample time to do so. Again, that's ideal state. Even 70 to 80% adherence to this is going to significantly improve that weekly cycle time for your payroll. And it'll get the payroll teams to a point that they don't feel like at the end of the week they've survived something, but they feel like they have really knocked it out of the park and been successful with the payroll process. All right. So this is what risk can look like at the pattern level. Now we're going to talk about the other end, because the same work that services those patterns also shows up somewhere else. It shows us what teams that don't have the problems tend to do differently. All right. So what are some of the non-negotiables that we see well-oiled machines from a payroll perspective doing? Those non-negotiable cutoffs. Team that operate with the least firefighting tend to have a firm shared understanding of when time is due and a defined answer for when it is not. And that's a lot of times the most critical thing. What is the process? And it's not punitive, it's just clear. Leadership supports it, or they aren't routinely granting exceptions. And the last part is more important than people realize. A cutoff that leadership overrides regularly isn't necessarily a cutoff with suggestions. So working comprehensively with your team on how you agree to handle situations where there is some late pay is really critical, or late timesheets. So second, a protected processing window. Most people we find have this scheduled. There are some customers who haven't quite done this yet. Maybe their business is really starting to grow. But once the time submission closes, the team that catches the most errors before they become problems are the ones who treat the processing window as that protected time. Questions get routed to a single point of contact rather than directly to whoever is in the middle of the calculation. This could also work if you're if you're one man operation or one woman operation, is to maybe have an email box that those questions go to, and then that follows into the process that you've established. I'm going to get the payroll out, and then we will be answering questions, as soon as that is out, and then we'll make adjustments as needed. And it's not about being inaccessible. It's about really creating those conditions where the actual work of payroll, all that really careful, focused work can happen. Third, one cycle at a time, doing our best to do one period before the next one opens, treating that as the goal. When corrections are necessary, those corrections go through a structured process rather than getting folded into the next run. And this keeps the pay period as clean and accurate as possible. Fourth, defined ownership at every handoff. We talked about that, making sure that it's very clear what those toll gates are and what are these quality checks that happen at each of those toll gates. So if I'm getting ready to process, to pass something off to Rachel, have I met the requirements of what needs to be true in order for Rachel to be able to pick it up, run with it, and do her part of the process? Making sure that everybody knows exactly what those are. So if I do hand something off to Rachel that's not complete, and Rachel knows what those expectations are, it's really easy for her to call me and say, hey, this was missing, we've got to correct it, and so that I can keep moving forward. All right. And fifth, communication that gets ahead of the question. When something changes, a process, a system, a policy. The teams that weather this the best have that kind of proactive communication, the right people, and enough lead time. These things probably sound really simple, and some of them really are. But building that internal discipline to maintain them consistently And getting cross functional buy in to make them stick is where the real work lies. All right, so process discipline is one side of this equation. But there's another question that comes with this, and I want to spend a few minutes on that. Even if a payroll team is disciplined, even if they've addressed every one of those five patterns, the question of how payroll is actually structured as a function matters because the structure either supports the discipline or it works against it. Most organizations fall into one of three models when it comes to how payroll is set up. I want to talk through each one of those. And the goal is for you to kind of self identify where you are and to have a clear view of what that model, what it requires for that model to work well. Okay, as promised, the three models. Fully in house, your team owns everything: processing, compliance, system management, everything. The upside there is control, full flexibility, deep institutional knowledge, the ability to adapt quickly to your specific environment. The consideration is everything that we talked about today: the structural discipline, the cutoff, the ownership, the communication. All of it has to come from within. When the team is well staffed, stable, experienced, it works really well. When the team is stretched or when key people might leave the organization, the operation can be exposed in ways that are harder to recover from quickly. Fully outsourced. Fully outsourced. So you hand in the executions, you everything over to an external vendor. The obvious appeal here is that it takes the burden off of your internal team. And for organizations with relatively standard, low complexity payroll, this can really work. The trade offs are flexibility and sometimes visibility. Fully outsourced models tend to come with rigid processes that don't adapt easily to the specific complexity of your environment. And when something might go wrong, and things can go wrong, your team's ability to understand what happens and course correct is a bit limited. Third, structured support. This is kind of the middle path. An external partner handles the execution, complexity, and compliance infrastructure. Your internal team keeps ownership and oversight. You're not handing off the wheel, you're adding a co pilot who helps you navigate the terrain. It's flexible enough to adapt to your specific environment and structured enough to scale as you grow. It's the model that tends to hold up best when organizations get more complex. And to be transparent, this is where Greenshades operates. I'm going to hand it back over to Rachel. Yes, I'm going to hand it back over to Rachel, and then we're going to get into Q&A.
Sounds great. So thanks, Catherine. I'm going to take a minute here to introduce again something that's directly relevant to today's topic. And we have experience working with, I think, customers across all of these models. But, a lot of what keeps payroll reactive comes down to one thing is when the people running it are stretched thin. So they're doing the validation, chasing the edge cases, managing the off cycle corrections, and a lot of that manual execution work leaves very little room to actually get ahead of problems. So that's the gap that Flex Payroll Agent is designed to close. This is a managed payroll service from Greenshades where a dedicated specialist runs payroll on your behalf inside the Greenshades payroll platform. Our team can handle full payroll processing every cycle, including off cycle and special payroll runs. And you and your team get full visibility into every run, and nothing gets posted ultimately without your final approval. So think of it in terms of these models. It fits in that middle option between running everything yourself and fully handing it off. You get that execution support without giving up control, and it's built for teams where payroll has a lot of moving parts and internal bandwidth is tight. So if that sounds familiar, Flex Payroll Agent may be a good fit for you. And um, we love to have that conversation. So you should be seeing a poll appear on your screen right about now. Yes. And if you are curious about Flex Payroll Agent and would like to speak to a team, to an expert who can walk you through how that could work for your specific setup, feel free to mark that option and we'll make sure the right person follows up with you directly.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We would be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Again, thank you to Catherine for all of the insight and the expertise here. And we hope to see you at a future webinar. That may be included in the email, so please take a look out for that as well. All right. Thank you, everyone.